So after having introduced with three estimates proposed by Matthew Arnold in as what we call the methods of reading poetry. Now we shall have a discussion on it. We refer to real estimate, historical estimate, and personal estimate. We understood that real estimate is unbiased and unprejudiced evaluation, a balanced approach in which historical context and innovation and the ability of the individual poet is taken into consideration. Then we talked about the historical estimate in which the background dominates and the value judgment with innovation and creativity is given less importance in comparison to the historical context of the poem. And then we talked about the personal estimate, wherein the personal and cognitive biases of the individual reader are dependent on they are dependent on the preferences and tastes of the individual reader, and they are brought into the reading of poetry. So after introducing these three estimates, Arnold thinks that even though historical and personal estimates are less reliable, so what is he saying? Historical and personal estimates are less reliable and arbitrary. Okay, they are more commonly seen than the real estimate. So Arnold is of the opinion that historic and personal estimates are less reliable and they're arbitrary. Reliable means you can't rely on them entirely. Less reliable. Reliable means to believe in something. You say you come across the word reliance. Reliance, and this is reliable. Reliable is an adjective. So these two estimates are less reliable, means you cannot trust them fully. At the same time, they're arbitrary. You must be knowing that language is arbitrary. Arbitrary means something which is traditional or conventionally accepted, traditionally or conventionally accepted. There is no logical explanation as such. Why we call a particular flower by the name of lotus or rose. There is no logical explanation to this question, because that is a kind of agreement in the speech community. So that is what arbitrary is. So you do not have logical explanation in these particular estimates, historic and personal estimate, when we compare them with real estimate. Okay, it means they are common than the real estimate. So Arnold calls this a natural consequence of human choice. So why does he call it as a natural consequence of human choice? Means why does he give priority to real estimate? So often the context of the text dominates the reader's perception and makes them overlook its manifest flaws. What happens many times? The context of the text dominates the reader's perception. The context means you might be knowing the situation, the scenario, the setting that dominates, and because the perception is dominated by the context, so consequently, what happens? The reader starts overlooking the flaws. Now, overlook means to ignore, because the reader's perception is dominated by the context of the text. And this dominance of the context of the text hampers the reader's perception itself. And the reader starts overlooking, ignoring, or neglecting the manifest flaws of the text. Manifest means which are visible, which can be seen. There are some flaws in the text, but they are overlooked. And this is about personal estimate. And historical significance means historical estimate can hide these shortcomings in plain sight because it tends to exalt the poem to an elevated status like classic or iconic. Means we give importance to history. As a result, we do not consider it, bad or something of this of inferior quality. The status given to poem is an elevated one. Elevated means high one, of high status. The status is given like classics or iconic. Iconic means role model. When we uh, look at the text from the historical perspective, then time as well, shortcomings are ignored because the poem gets the higher status. So this is how he thinks that these two estimates, historic estimates and personal estimates, have their own shortcomings, their own drawbacks. When we talk about an iconic poem, an iconic means the role model. You might be knowing you have your icons around. Business icons we talk about, sports icons we talk about. Okay, Sachin Tendulkar, for example, in the field of cricket. So an iconic poem means a role model acts as the barometer for other poems. Means other poems are judged in terms of this poem. Historical, when you give importance to historical background, then time, we start judging every poem against that poem, just like neoclassical poets. So it is held at the standard against which other works are compared. So that becomes a kind of standard. For example, neoclassicists thought that Homer, Virgil, and other classicists should become our role models. And they started judging every work by comparing that work to the work of Homer and Virgil. So that became a kind of judging criteria. And when the poem falls short to that comparison, that kind of measurement, then time we make a subjective evaluation, the personal evaluation. So this comparison helps in arriving at the true value of a poem. He's talking about the historical estimate. Okay, when we compare, of course, he's not saying that it is bad and all. He's trying to tell that a particular poem, a particular work of literature becomes a kind of role model, an icon, and we judge it against that particular role model or icon. And that helps us in arriving at the true value of a poem. So Arnold suggests people, exhorts people to devour. Devour means you must be familiar with the term devour. Devour means to engulf something greedily, to eat something. Adasipane khane. Devour here is referred to reading. You should devour such classic works of poetry to educate their sense of judgment and censor. So one should have the classical knowledge, the knowledge of classical poetry. And why do we need to read classical poetry? To educate our sense of judgment, means to have knowledge, to understand how to judge the things. So that can help in the development of judgment and censorship. But still, we should remain aware of their own flaws and errors as well. Okay? Means it does not mean that you read classical books and you know everything, and that is the only perfect way of judging the things. So there can be the flaws and errors in that in those works as well. in classical works as well. We should be aware of that. That's what he says. So Arnold tries to talk about the inspiration and imitation in the context of historical significance. Arnold argues that poets are often so inspired or moved by the classical works of poetry that they often tend to borrow their content or ideas. So this is how inspiration and imitation work. They get inspired and then they imitate the classical works. They are so much inspired, just like neoclassicists, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, etc. All these poets were highly inspired by the classicists, and they thought that we should imitate the classicists, the classical poetry. So it is often an issue for the poets who cannot detach themselves from their favorite classics. Means they start imitating them, borrowing their content or ideas. So they are, by doing so, they are committing error. They are subject to erroneous conclusions because they cannot detach themselves from their favorite classics. Means they have that icon in their mind. They have their role model in their mind. And they start judging everything against that. And if they think that, if they find that though some qualities are missing in this particular work, then they consider it is bad, not of good quality at all. So their judging criteria is historical model, we can say, the classical model. So historic estimates in the case of poets from earlier times and personal estimate in the case of contemporaneous poets create difficulties. Okay. So what happens? By using historical estimate or personal estimate, what happens? In case of historic estimates, poets from earlier times are considered as role models and everything is compared to them. And in case of personal estimate, the contemporariness of contemporaneous poets means contemporary poets, create difficulties in ascertaining the true value and significance of poetry. So both the approaches, both the estimates have some or other flaws. Means either in case of historical estimate, what happens? The poets from earlier times become role model and everything, we tend to compare everything with them itself. And in case of personal estimate, what happens? The contemporary poets create difficulties in ascertaining the true value and significance of poetry because the contemporary poets do not come up with any significant what we call value of poetry, we can say. So, miss, now you just this is very what you call abstract to understand. I'll tell you the example. Suppose we talk it in the context of Hindi movies. When we think about classical movies, old Hindi songs especially, let's take the example of songs itself. There is a group of people who think that all new songs are not at all good in comparison to the old songs. So this is what being judgmental is. And further, when we think from a personal estimate point of view, we think, that there is no true value and significance of the content or the message in the poem, in the songs or new songs. So both the approaches are problematic. Therefore, we should rely more on real estimate. In real estimate, what happens? The approach is unbiased, unprejudiced. is a kind of fine balance between historical context and innovation. Everything is taken to consideration. The historical context is taken to consideration means how the poem goes in line with the historical role model, classical role model, how it comes up with the newness, how the ability, the talent of the poet is reflected. All these things are taken to consideration. So he thinks that real estimate is better than historical estimate and personal estimate. Okay, so this is how he talks about the act of reading poetry. Of course, we are going to talk about certain other things in the next part of my discussion.